Okay, in this video we're going to look at downloading and installing Blender and just setting up the most basic of startup settings. So if you've never opened up Blender before, if you've never even downloaded Blender before, your first option is to go to blender.org/download and just simply download the most recent stable version. Now the version I'm going to be using mostly in this course is going to be Blender 3. I will do some of it in 2.93.5, especially if things aren't quite working in Blender 3, because some of it can still be a little bit unstable. But to be honest, Blender 3 is going to be out in probably the next 3-4 months, so it makes more sense just now to do it in Blender 3. There's really not many differences. There's practically no UI differences that I can see that are at all significant. It's definitely not the same change that happened between 2.79 and 2.8, or even between 2.8 and 2.9. So definitely recommend not only downloading 2.93 or whichever is the most recent stable release on blender.org, but also consider downloading an experimental daily build of Blender 3 and maybe even switching between them. Use one day to do one part of the course, do Blender 3 for the next part of the course, and just decide amongst yourselves which one suits you better. Is alpha working okay on your system? Is it in beta maybe and working even better? Is there a feature that alpha has that you don't have in 2.93 that you really need to complete a certain part of the course? Most likely the answer is no. You're going to be able to do it in 2.93, but I would definitely recommend it. Now that leads you to a little bit of a problem, and that is you're going to have all these different versions of Blender on your system. So instead of downloading from blender.org, I actually recommend downloading Blender Launcher. So I'm going to do a search for Blender Launcher, and if we go to this version here, you can actually find a review of it here on Blender Nation, which I think is probably where I found out about it. But you can go to the GitHub page and you can see that we have all this information about it. We've got installation guide, etc., which is incredibly easy to follow, and also some information about the user interface, and you can also obviously download it from the GitHub. So let's just show you Blender Launcher very quickly here. I'm just going to open it up, and what you'll find is immediately as soon as you open it up, you can set up which settings open up as default. Along the top you've got library, which is what you've downloaded, downloads, which is what is available to you, and user, this is any favorites and custom versions you have. We'll go back to library. This is everything I've downloaded. So I have one stable release, which is the most recent one, which was on blender.org. We'll just jump back to that there, so you can see 2.93.5, most recent stable release. We have daily builds, which are alpha builds, and the candidate for the next most recent stable release. And we have experimental builds, which I don't have any of at the moment. If we go back to stable and we go to downloads, you can see we have a list of all the stable releases that Blender have put out all the way back to 2.79 in September of 2017. We have all these LTS versions. Now LTS stands for long-term support. Now if you happen to be planning a multi-year project and you want to be using the same version of Blender all throughout your project without worrying that some bug pops up because of an update in Windows or whichever your operating system is, and Blender just decides I can't deal with this update and just starts crashing, long-term support means that Blender Foundation will keep releasing bug fixes for whichever version of Blender you pick here, to make sure things like changes in your operating system and Windows 11, which is coming out, I think is actually already out, any changes that happen will be fixed in Blender, so you can continue using 2.83 if you want, or 2.93 for the next couple of years without having to worry about Blender just saying no, we don't update that anymore, we're not fixing this bug that's ruined your project. So that's just one thing to think about there. again in downloads we've got our daily builds, we've got the candidate for 2.8319, so that's actually very recent, but that's going to be a candidate for the next stable build it looks like. We have our experimental build, so this is where things get really interesting because these are versions of Blender 3.0 alpha, and it's a branch where someone is going in and they're essentially changing the code every day or every few days, working on specific things. So here we've got someone working on geometry nodes, we've got someone working on sculpting. I'm sure I saw something for, oh yeah, we've got cycles, we've got merge master, universal scene description. Most of these things I don't know what they're going to be doing, how much is going to be different in them. That's why they're experimental. I recommend sticking with a daily build of alpha and a stable version of the most recent 2.93, or hopefully by the time you're watching this, the most recent stable version of Blender 3. So what you're going to see when you open up the Blender launcher, if you do decide to use it, you're going to go to preferences. In fact, I think it asks you as soon as you open it up where you want to save your files. I chose my C drive program files Blender Foundation because that's where all my versions of Blender have always went. So you can see I've got 2.81 all the way up to Blender 3 alpha. These are experimental builds. These folders here that just say 2.9, these actually came from the installs on blender.org. So that's what comes onto your system when you use an installer. The other folder is what happens when you use a portable zip or if you download one of these experimental files. And I'll show you one of these experimental files that I've unzipped just earlier on today. What you get is you get all these files, you get all this stuff in here, and the only thing you have to worry about is this one blender.exe application, which essentially runs Blender straight from this folder without really affecting the rest of your system. It does add a preferences and a startup file to a different folder. I'm just going to quickly find that folder. So it's actually in your user app data roaming. You see we've got a Blender Foundation folder, and this actually saves user preferences and startup files for every version of Blender that's ever been on your system. So you can see again I've got versions going back to 2.79. The most recent version is 3. I've actually just before this video started I deleted my startup file and my user preferences file just because I want to be able to open up Blender and show you exactly what you're going to see. So again, I'm just going to stick with a Blender launcher for this whole course. I definitely recommend getting it because it just means that like maybe you sit down to use Blender one day and there's a new version of Blender, you can just go in, you can click download that new version of Blender, continue on using the old one until it's downloaded, and then just open up your file in the new version. You don't have to worry about where it's downloading, you don't have to worry about unzipping, you don't have to worry about installers, add-ons, startup files, user preferences, all that stuff seems to be taken care of by Blender Launcher. So in the next video we're going to actually open up Blender. Okay, welcome back. So in the last video we looked at downloading Blender and I recommended using Blender Launcher, and that's what we're going to do to open up the most recent version of Blender 3 Alpha. So I'm going to hit launch, and this is what you're going to be faced with. You're going to be faced with this screen here, which if you've never used Blender before or you're new to 3D in general, probably starts to look a little bit intimidating at this point. So I just want to take a moment. 90% of this we're going to be covering throughout this course. The most important stuff we're going to get to as early as possible. So this is what you're going to get immediately. We have the version of Blender we're using. We have our language setting, which obviously choose which language suits you. We've got shortcuts. I'm going to say right now, recommend you stick with Blender shortcuts. Don't go with industry compatible, because it just means that when you're doing a tutorial or you're following a course or you're looking at a Blender book or anything at all, it's going to be talking about Blender hotkeys. It's not going to be talking about Max hotkeys or Maya hotkeys or ZBrush hotkeys, so stick with Blender and you won't get confused. Select. Obviously, again, I'm going to say stick with left click. It's now the default in Blender, so that's the way I would go with it. If you are so stuck in 2.79 that you prefer to use right click, that's fine. Everything I do in this course, I'm going to be assuming you're using left click. So if this is a preference for you, that's absolutely fine. Do whatever suits you. Use the tool that works best for you. Spacebar, again, another personal preference. When you hit spacebar in this, the timeline starts. I don't like that behaviour personally. Tools is a good option if you want to be able to bring up a tool menu really quick, but again, I'll be using things like quick menus and the tools at the side of the screen. So I actually prefer search because I just want to be able to hit spacebar and quickly type in a search. The theme, again, this is again a preference thing. Do you want to go with dark? Do you want to go with light? Deep grey? I just want to show you one thing really quickly here. So I'm going to jump into users, find my folder, app data, roaming, Blender Foundation. I just want to show you exactly what happens here when we go and save our new settings. So we click on that and let me just bring that back. You can see our user preference file has been saved here. Let me just show you in real time what happens if we go in here and we save our startup file. Save startup file. You can see a startup file has now been saved in there. If you ever have any problems with Blender immediately crashing when you start it up, there might be a problem with your startup file or there might be a problem with your user preference file. I recommend just going in and just deleting them, and that way next time you open up Blender, actually we don't want to do that, we want to open it up. Next time we open up Blender, you'll get all these options again. It's not a big deal to go in and change all your user preferences and all your workspaces and things like that. It's much better than having to deal with a program that takes 5, 6, 7 attempts to open every time you want to open it up. So again, I'm just going to quickly change some settings, save my new settings. So here is the splash screen. This is going to start up by default every time you open up Blender. It's going to give you your recent files. It's going to give you an option to open up another file or recover your last session, which sometimes can be useful. As you can see there, that's open the last closed file, quit.blend. That's essentially the file that is saved when you go to quit. You can open a new file. Now what this will do is, if you hit general, it will open up Blender the way you see here. If you open up, say, 2D animation, you're going to get Blender looking like this. So immediately you're in draw mode. You're in here, you've got grease pencil opened up, you've got your layers. For your grease pencil, you've got palettes, you've got your brushes, etc. Everything is totally different. Your workspaces at the top are totally different. You've got your 2D animation, your composite, and you've got your rendering.
Section 2. Installing our software. So the first thing we have to do is download our software. So we go to blender.org and click on the download section. I've previously used and uninstalled Blender on this particular system, so that we can install it together from scratch. In the download section, we have options for Windows, Mac or Linux. Depending on your system, you may have the option of a 32 or a 64-bit version, as well as downloading and installing from a zip file or using an installer. You can download the source file or a daily build, but I recommend sticking to the most recent stable build, in this case Blender 2.78. Now I'm running a Windows 10 system. It's 64 bits and I prefer to use an installer, so I'll just click on my nearest mirror, which I believe would be the Netherlands. I'll pause the video while the installer downloads. So it's finished downloading and I'll just click on the installer. You may find this in your default downloads folder, but for me Chrome shows my downloads at the bottom of the screen, so I'll just click there. I'd like to take a moment to just mention at this point that I'm working on multiple monitors, and occasionally a new window may open up in another monitor. If that happens, I'll just drag it onto this main screen so you can see it. I'm also recording on a 1280 by 720 display for screen capture purposes, so the resolution of my display is not as high as I'm used to, and if your display is a higher resolution, you'll notice that everything on my screen is probably much larger than on yours. So I'll just click on Next, and I'll accept the terms and conditions. Now you can use Blender free for commercial use, so you don't need to worry about royalties or fees if you ever start making money from either your art or by creating commercial animation or game art. So like most install wizards, you just click Next and stick to the defaults to install. Blender downloads and installs fairly fast. It's quite light software compared to many other 3D applications. There's not a lot of additional downloads like documentation, tutorial files, videos, material libraries, etc. to download and install. So just click your way through the installer until everything is complete, and click Finish. Now before we leave blender.org, just go to the demo files option and download a few different demo file scenes so that later on in the course we can demonstrate how to navigate 3D scenes as we look at some of the basic panels like Outliner, Info Panel and 3D View. So I'll just select the Racing Car, Fishy Cat, BMW Benchmark and Classroom files. These download zip files, so between lessons your challenge is to unzip these. In the next lesson, we'll open up Blender for the first time and start exploring and customizing the interface.